What if every ballot you cast is actually a permission slip for your own subjugation? What if the system we've elevated as humanity's greatest political achievement is simply tyranny with better marketing? Here's a moment that shattered illusions. When millions of Americans watched the 2024 election results, something crystallized. Despite years of democratic norms being tested, despite clear warnings about authoritarian tendencies, voters chose based on immediate economic discomfort rather than long-term democratic stability. The cognitive dissonance was brutal and revealing. But this crisis of faith wasn't new. Over 2,400 years ago, Plato witnessed his mentor Socrates executed by a democratic mob and reached a chilling conclusion. Democracy doesn't liberate people from tyranny. It makes tyranny feel like freedom. Modern psychology has vindicated Plato's warnings in terrifying ways. Solomon Asch's conformity experiment showed that 75% of people will abandon clear evidence from their own senses to avoid disagreeing with a group. If we can't trust ourselves to identify which line is longer when the answer is obvious, how can we trust millions of strangers to choose our leaders wisely? But here's what should truly disturb you. In 2006, researchers at Emory University conducted brain scans on partisan voters while they processed information about their preferred candidates. When confronted with clear evidence of their candidates' contradictions or failures, the brain regions associated with reasoning showed no increased activity while emotion circuits lit up. The subjects weren't just ignoring uncomfortable facts. Their brains were physically rewarding them for avoiding cognitive dissonance. Your brain is literally designed to love democratic manipulation. To understand why modern democracy functions as a polite dictatorship, we must first acknowledge what it gets right. Democracy promises something psychologically irresistible: the feeling that you matter, that your voice counts, that complex social problems can be solved through collective wisdom. But here's what Plato understood that we've forgotten. The most effective control doesn't feel like control at all. Democratic systems have perfected something authoritarian regimes could never achieve: mass participation in our own subjugation while feeling empowered by the process. Traditional dictatorships create resistance through obvious oppression. But democratic systems channel dissent into sanctioned outlets: elections, protests, petitions that provide psychological relief without threatening real power structures. This is the psychological genius of what political scientist Stephen Levitsky calls competitive authoritarianism. You feel like you're fighting the system when you vote against incumbents, but you're actually legitimizing the very framework that constrains your choices. As Plato observed, the heaviest penalty for declining to rule is to be ruled by someone inferior to yourself. But democratic systems ensure you never realize how inferior your actual rulers are because you chose them. Plato's most prescient insight was understanding how democratic freedom creates its own destruction. In the Republic, he mapped out a precise sequence. Democracy generates cognitive overload, which creates demand for simplification, which empowers demagogues, which leads to tyranny disguised as popular will. Modern neuroscience explains why this progression is nearly inevitable. When faced with information overload, your brain's prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thinking, becomes overwhelmed and shuts down. Your limbic system takes control, making decisions based on emotion and instinct rather than analysis. Venezuela's trajectory illustrates this perfectly. Hugo Chavez didn't seize power through military force. He won 56% of the vote in 1998 by promising relief from Venezuela's overwhelming political complexity. Citizens weren't choosing tyranny. They were choosing psychological comfort. This reveals democracy's fatal flaw. It systematically rewards leaders who are good at winning elections, not governing effectively. These are completely different skill sets that often conflict directly. The psychological traits that make someone appealing to voters — confidence, simplicity, emotional resonance — are precisely the opposite of what effective governance requires: humility, complexity, analytical thinking. Plato captured this in his ship of fools metaphor. Imagine a vessel where passengers vote on navigation decisions. The skilled navigator understands wind patterns and currents, but sounds uncertain when explaining complex maritime challenges. Meanwhile, charismatic passengers promise smooth sailing, confidently dismissing the navigator's warnings as elitist fear-mongering. Who do you think the passengers choose, and what happens to the ship? We don't vote on surgical procedures or engineering specifications. We defer to people who have spent decades mastering complex knowledge. But in politics, expertise becomes a liability. Real experts tend to express uncertainty and acknowledge complexity. This triggers what psychologists call ambiguity aversion. We're naturally uncomfortable with uncertainty and prefer confident answers, even when they're wrong. Look around at your current political leaders. Are these the wisest, most competent people you know? Or are they the most ambitious, most persuasive, most willing to tell you what you want to hear? Plato's cave allegory isn't just philosophical metaphor. It's a technical manual for understanding how modern information systems shape democratic consciousness. We're all chained to our devices, watching carefully curated shadows that algorithms select to maximize engagement and minimize discomfort. But here's what makes contemporary democratic control more sophisticated than anything Plato imagined. The shadows are personalized. Your social media feed and news sources are customized to reinforce your existing beliefs while creating the illusion of informed choice. The Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed something even more disturbing. Using psychological profiles built from Facebook data, political operatives could target individuals with customized messages designed to exploit their specific psychological vulnerabilities. Anxious people received fear-based content. Narcissistic people received content that made them feel special. This wasn't traditional propaganda aimed at everyone. It was personalized psychological warfare aimed at you specifically. This creates confirmation bias on steroids. People consuming different information streams aren't just disagreeing about policy. They're literally experiencing different realities. Both sides feel fully informed and morally superior while being systematically manipulated by forces they don't recognize. This is happening to you right now. Algorithms are learning your preferences, and your information environment is being quietly customized to influence your thoughts and behaviors in ways you don't even realize. The Weimar Republic provides perhaps the clearest example of how democratic psychology enables tyrannical outcomes. Germany in the 1920s was a functioning democracy with robust civil liberties and competitive elections. Yet when economic crisis created cognitive overload, German voters didn't resist authoritarianism. They welcomed it. Hitler's rise illustrates something crucial about democratic vulnerability. People don't choose tyranny because they love oppression. They choose it because freedom becomes psychologically unbearable. The Nazi Party's electoral success came from offering relief from the exhausting burden of democratic choice. Hitler promised to handle everything: economics, foreign policy, social problems, so ordinary Germans could stop worrying about issues they felt unqualified to judge. This pattern repeats throughout history because it exploits fundamental features of human psychology rather than temporary political circumstances. Look around the world today. How many democracies are currently experiencing this exact dynamic? Understanding democracy as a polite dictatorship requires examining not just psychological manipulation, but institutional design. Democratic systems appear to distribute power broadly, while actually concentrating it in less visible ways. Consider how modern democratic governments actually function. Elected officials make highly visible decisions about relatively minor issues, while crucial policy areas, monetary policy, regulatory frameworks, international agreements, are handled by unelected bureaucrats and international organizations largely insulated from democratic pressure. This creates what political scientists call the democratic deficit. Important decisions get made by people who aren't accountable to voters, while elected officials have limited influence over outcomes that actually affect citizens' lives. The visible aspects of democratic governance consume enormous psychological energy, while having minimal impact on substantive policy. Citizens feel deeply engaged with political processes that are largely theatrical, while real power operates through channels they barely recognize. When policies fail, the response is typically to demand more democracy rather than examining whether democratic processes are structurally capable of producing better outcomes. This is the genius of the system. It makes you complicit in your own powerlessness while convincing you that you're in control. So what do we do with this uncomfortable knowledge? Plato's answer wasn't to abandon political engagement, but to approach it with proper understanding. In the cave allegory, the philosopher who escapes has a moral obligation to return and attempt education, even knowing that most people will reject uncomfortable truths. This means engaging with democratic processes as a conscious participant rather than an unconscious victim. Instead of expecting democracy to be something it isn't, a system for translating popular wisdom into effective governance, we can appreciate it for what it actually is: a method for managing human psychological needs while maintaining relative social stability. Consciousness doesn't solve the fundamental problems with democratic governance, but it does change your relationship to political participation. When you understand how your brain gets manipulated by confident leaders and emotional appeals, you could develop some resistance to these influences. When you recognize that your political opinions are shaped more by psychological needs than rational analysis, you can become more humble about your certainty and more curious about perspectives that challenge your assumptions. Most importantly, consciousness allows you to participate in political systems without being psychologically enslaved by them. You can vote and engage while maintaining critical distance from the mythology that makes these activities feel more meaningful than they actually are. Right now, the same psychological mechanisms that destroyed democratic institutions in Germany, Venezuela, and countless other nations are operating in your country. The personalized information warfare that turns neighbors into enemies is targeting your feeds. The choice overload that makes people crave authoritarian simplicity is overwhelming your cognitive capacity every day. The demagogues are already among us, promising relief from the complexity and uncertainty that freedom requires. They're gaining support not because people are evil, but because people are exhausted by the psychological burden of democratic participation. The question isn't whether modern democracy functions as a polite dictatorship. Plato's analysis makes that clear. The question is whether you'll participate consciously, with full awareness of the psychological mechanisms at work, or continue sleepwalking through the motions of citizenship while real power operates beyond your awareness. This choice isn't about cynicism versus idealism. It's about consciousness versus unconsciousness. Plato saw this choice coming over 2 millennia ago. He witnessed it in ancient Athens, predicted it would repeat throughout history, and his insights apply perfectly to our contemporary situation. The only difference is that our democratic illusions are more sophisticated, our psychological manipulation more subtle, and our need for uncomfortable self-awareness more urgent than ever. Your brain wants you to reject this message because it threatens comfortable beliefs about the system you live in. The reaction, that's exactly what Plato was talking about. The choice to think past that reaction, that's the first step toward genuine freedom. The unexamined democracy is not worth preserving, and the unexamined citizen is not truly free. The most dangerous tyranny is the one that feels like freedom, and your brain is wired to love it. Question your assumptions. Seek uncomfortable truths. The shadows on the wall are more beautiful than reality, but only reality can set you free. The cave is comfortable. The light is harsh. But the choice to step toward the light, that choice is still yours. For now,